Hello, and welcome to Translation Expanding Our Horizons. My name is Sakshi Kumar, and I am the Adult Programs Coordinator at Writers and Books. I am an Asian American woman with short black hair, wearing a light brown shirt and an olive green cardigan. Writers and Books would like to call attention to the complex and troubled history of the lands on which we live and work. We are recording this panel from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Onondaga, or the people of the Great Hill. In English, they are known as the Seneca people, or the keeper of the Western Door. As I mentioned, this is translation, expanding our horizons. Literature and translation offers important ways of connecting to and understanding the world. Here, three acclaimed authors and translators read from and discuss the indispensable work of transcending borders and barriers through language. Our panelists are Cyrus Cassells, Jennifer Kellogg, and K.E. Semmel. Our moderator is Kaya Straminis. Our authors' books will be available through Writers and Books' indie bookstore, Ampersand Books. I encourage you to read their full bios on our website, www.wab.org. Thank you.
All right. I guess that means moving on to me. I am Kaya Straminis. I am a Caucasian woman with long hair, wearing a black sweater. And I am the editorial director at Open Letter Books, which is a nonprofit publisher in Rochester. Big fans of writers and books. And I am moderating this panel, and truly I want it to be mostly a time for my panelists to speak. So my role I see is more as timekeeper and peacekeeper. I don't think I'll be needing to keep any peace because we've touched base previously, and all three of you are very lovely, very, very friendly people. But I will be keeping a look on time. And I don't now remember. Ooh, I feel like I should go through and do the bios, but I know Sakchi said they'd be online. But just a quick, um, maybe I'll leave it for it's online. Panelists, do you want to nod if I should leave it for the online part so we don't take up too much time? Okay. So the way we're going to run this panel is that we are going to have a mix of readings and conversation. And we talked about 7 to 8 minutes of reading that I hope each of you will have prepared. I will cap it off at 10 minutes in case it goes over, but hopefully you've timed yourselves out. And then we will have little discussions between these readings. I will be directing a question specifically to the person who has just read. And I would, however, encourage the other two panelists to jump in on the conversation, share your experiences in conjunction and parallel. Because I want it to be free flowing. And like I said, I don't want to hear my own voice too much, and I've already heard too much of it at this point. So we will be kicking off with Cyrus. One thing, actually, before I forget, one thing I did want to say is that just a couple days ago, Literary Hub published an essay by Jane Hirschfield that is on this very topic of our panel, and it's a wonderful article. It's called In Words and Beyond Them, on the transformative art of translation. And the last big thing I want to say is I do want to read something from the very end of her essay that I thought was very nice, and relevant to today's panel. At the very end, she says, translation then and our continuing practice and support of it has a transformative social dimension, welcoming the sheer variousness and plurality of all lives, holding the desire to feel what others have felt, to see what they have seen, to imagine what they have imagined, wanting to know oneself not as soloist, but as part of a larger chorus, and wanting that full chorus heard, its full music sung across time, place, culture, language, causes, and conditions. This is the path of kinship rather than closure. And I can send a link to Writers and Books. They can post it in the panel notes. But I think that is it's a great way to think about it. And yeah, so let's get started. Cyrus, you will be reading from Salvador Espriu, and you can correct the name. And he is a Catalan author. So please grace us with your with your reading.
As it turns out, Jane and I have been friends for over 40 years. So it's really inspiring to start the panel with words from her. I'm going to give us more quotes about translation. In an essay published in Writing, A Mosaic of New Perspectives, poet translator Randall Couch depicts the process of translation as a burning house. He says, a poem to be translated is a house, if not a palace, on fire. It contains diverse occupants to be carried over to safety to another place. The fire exists because of the incommensurability of languages, and its intensity ensures that, at least in the first instance, the act of translation will result in loss. So the question, to what or to whom must the translator be faithful, can be dramatized as what or who can be saved. Couch quotes Jean Cocteau's, if my house was on fire, what would I take? I'd like to take the fire. Lisa Raspar, in reviewing Still Life with Children, selected poems of Francesc Parcerisas, my translations of another Catalan poet, emphasizes translations as restoration, resurrection, renewal. She says, in many ways, a translation is a, quote, second act. Survivors of house fires, for instance, will not only recount what they've been able to save from a burning building, a child, a pet, photographs, a piece of family jewelry, the clothes on their backs, a beloved book, but often speak as well of having been given a second chance, the gracious opportunity of starting anew. About Salvador Espriu. Before the Spanish Civil War's ferocious freefall and the Spanish Republic's collapse, Salvador Espriu had been a prolific literary prodigy with 5 books to his name, 2 novels, and 3 short story collections. As a result of Franco's military conquest in 1939 and the tyrannical banning of the Catalan language, there were signs everywhere that said, don't bark, speak the language of the empire. Espriu turned almost exclusively to poetry and plays. As he struggled to preserve his imperiled language and patrimony, we learned to descend steps of grief, my people and I. His poems achieved a spare intensity and a meticulous, bare-bones beauty, reminiscent of Samuel Beckett. According to major Catalan critic Didac Llorens Cubedo, quote, Espriu produced a body of literature that can be considered, among other things, a vindication of his own language, persecuted and belittled under Franco's regime. My experience as a translator is the most dramatic one I know. In the summer of 1984, I shared my Espriu translations with my friend and mentor, H. Joan Freeman, a deeply intuitive and highly regarded astrologer and columnist. She called me on a dog day evening on Cape Cod to say she needed to discuss my translations in person, adding, don't worry, they're beautiful. When I arrived at her bay-facing A-frame house in Provincetown, she informed me that while reading Espriu's work, it became clear to her, quote, that this man's about to die, and you must do everything in your power to see him before he goes. You must leave for Spain as soon as you can. Fortunately, I was in a position to travel again to Barcelona. Time never ticked so loudly for me as the warm September. I waited to secure a meeting with the high priest of Catalan letters. Through generous and thoughtful friends, it was arranged for me to stay with writer and director Guillaume Gordy-Graenge, a key figure of the Catalan National Theatre. A boon, since Jordi had a fantastic library of Catalan literature that included all of Espriu's works. In the final days of my month-long stay, I finally revealed Joan's unsettling prophecy about Espriu's imminent death to Alex Hassona, a friend and poet my age who was translating T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets into Catalan. A few days later in a cafe, Alex announced, "We are going to meet Espriu." He had arranged through the Mallorcan poet Jaume Vidal Colbert, a longtime friend of Espriu, for a visit to the poet's elegant place in the Passeig de Gràcia so that I could submit my translations to Espriu directly. Given the fact that he was notoriously private and reclusive, Alex and I expected the meeting to be relatively brief and formal. To our astonishment, we stayed for 4 hours and were joined by the great Catalan novelist Maria Aurelia Campmange, Jaume Alcover's partner, who brought along a scrumptious box of chocolates. It was the first week of October 1984, in the days that preceded the annual announcement of the Nobel Prize for Literature. And in a drape of cigar smoke, Alcover and Campmange reminded Espriu that he was Catalan Spain's prime candidate. Espriu shook his head, insisting that the Nobel jurors were loath to give the prize to a writer working in a stateless language. The revered literary critic Harold Bloom once hailed Espriu as, quote, an extraordinary poet by any international standard, and later insisted, the Nobel Committee is guilty of many errors, and one of those was not having given the prize to Salvador Espriu. I believe he deserved it. During our surprising visit, Espriu expressed disbelief that I had never read Cervantes' Don Quixote, then granted me written permission for my versions, kindly promising to respond to my labor. As he signed the permission, he mentioned that he felt the finest translations of his work were in English. Alex and I left this unexpectedly vibrant, even buoyant evening with Espriu and his longtime friends, all extraordinary writers, as if we 2 up-and-coming poets had been to visit the fabled Wizard of Oz. The day after Espriu's death on February 22nd, 1985, Alex received in haunting fashion a package from Espriu, meticulously wrapped with a signed volume of his poetry. Alex let Maria Aurelia and Jaume Alcover know of my mentor, Joan Freeman's unerring prophecy of Espriu's death, and they were naturally stunned. As fate would have it, Espriu died the same weekend as my paternal grandfather, and it was also extraordinary, mysterious, and overwhelming a series of events and coincidences that, despite continuing to refine my Espriu translations, I didn't return to Barcelona for 20 years. So this book, which is called To the Cypress Again and Again, is the long and coming result of my profound and truly mystical journey into Catalan literature and culture. From the start of my project, I was seeking to create something personal, almost indescribable, about my uncanny encounter with so venerable a man and writer. As a now mature artist, I like to imagine myself a diligent cosmopolitan heir, so to immensely purposeful and devoted Espriu. As an intrepid African-American writer and ambassador, working frankly and freely in the world at large. As my brilliant friend, the Paris-based American poet Alleyne once asserted, quote, poetry is an independent ambassador for conscience. It answers to no one. It crosses borders without a passport and it speaks the truth. Certainly, the master builder Espriu's impactful and absorbing work reached me at the start of my own burgeoning poetry career in such a powerful and borderless way.
Great, thank you. That's a wild, wild story. I know you sent me a question that I could ask you about the research, but really what I want to know then is how did you come to translation? Because you are, I mean, you sort of buried the lead there. How did
Did
how did you yeah,
I?
how did you come to yeah, how did you come to translation? How did you discover this author and um
Okay. I got the crazy notion in my head when I was 25 that Barcelona was the place to be. And so I started researching Catalan literature. I read an article in the Village Voice by David H. Rosendahl, who was the premier translator of Catalan literature into English. So I tried to get a hold of the book. So I just called him up. He said, "Why don't you just come over to my apartment, in the city, and I will sell you some of the books I had." So he had a book called Modern Catalan Poetry, and I read through it, and I got interested in various poets, mostly Francesc Parcerisas and Espriu. And then that summer, I traveled to Barcelona, fully planning to live there, but circumstances were otherwise. And I came back to the States. I was in a period where I had writer's block, which was sort of embarrassing because I had a fellowship at the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. And after about halfway through my fellowship, I couldn't write anymore. So for me, translation was a way to keep the machinery going and also to learn. So yeah, I mean, I was drawn to translation specifically to translate Francesc and Salvador Espriu. And in the beginning, I was a bit confused because my own writing is sort of lush and ornate and intricate sort of style. My style is like the opposite of this Espriu, which is so it took me a long time to understand why I was so drawn to such an austere poet. And that was a kind of political and moral education abroad that I had in Spain and the former Soviet Union, about learning about my capacity to absorb war experiences and sort of extreme experiences. But for years, I was baffled by that, why people kept coming to me with their testimony.
mm,
I met someone who was a child prisoner in Terezin, which was a transit camp outside of Prague. And he gave me part of a poem that he started to write when the Russians liberated the camps, and said, "Oh, here, Cyrus, I want you to finish the poem for me." And that was kind of the moment I realized that people from another generation were passing their legacy on to me in some way. So that was the beginning of my. I had done a little bit of translation in high school of Lorca, who's my favorite, sort of my hero poet. And my latest finished book of poems is called Lorca to the Umpteenth Power. And I've worked on it for 10 years. It's a hybrid book of my 5 pilgrimages to Granada. And then translates a little bit of translations, but mostly poems I wrote to Lorca over the years. So, and like I said, it's been an education in terms of, we mentioned research, just learning about the Spanish Civil War.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that does bring you back to that question of what sort of research you had to go into. I know Kyle has a question as that.
Yeah, Cyrus, I'm really curious about, you mentioned that you write very differently from this for you, and
Mhm.
I find that fascinating. How do you how do you translate a poet and write differently? Like, how do you do that in such a way that you don't let the poet's work, say, bleed into your own, or maybe even vice versa? What steps do you take?
Well, it's tricky and it's interesting because what was cool for me at the same time is my great friend Magda Balcones, who was famous as the translator of Isabel Allende's House of the Spirits, was also working on translations of Espriu. And I was relieved because I wanted to work on Espriu's early poetry. His first book of poems is very much rooted in his village north of Barcelona. It's called Arenys de Mar, Arenys de Mar, but in the poems he's reversed it. It's called Cinera. So his first book of poems is called Cinera Cemetery. And when I read it, I had such a strong sense of the village and the cemetery that I wanted to. So basically, I wanted to translate the poems that were rooted in his village, in his town. The farther along in his career, the more psychological and intense it was. Like I said, it was like Beckett there. And I'm so glad that there are Magda's translations, which Norton published in 1989, and they've always remained in print. And my style and translations, which are, as someone pointed out in review, rather different because I have a very, I don't know, I'm super word conscious and language conscious and precise, which matches up with the sense of him preserving the language. But I'm also rather a refined sort of poet. I'm not a blunt poet at all. So, though I've been stretching that lately in some of my political poetry, I have a book called The World That the Shooter Left Us. Not much refinement in response to gun violence. So there is a kind of signature that's me in my translations as opposed to Magda's and some other people's there. But it's a tricky thing. I mean, I guess it's clear in my translations of Parcerisas where I opted for shorter lines rather than his longer, sort of slightly more prose-like lines, just out of my own sense of English. I mean, my goal is to create English language poems that are successful in English, right? In the meantime, trying to catch the spirit or the essence of what he was doing. So that's why it was so important to get an education. I think for me, it was slightly traumatic because I was the same age he was when his language was ripped away from him. I was also a prodigy person. I won the National Poetry Series when I was 23 years old. And I think until recently, I was the youngest ever winner. And I wasn't quite settled in my identity as a poet. But part of my process of transcending Espriu meant that I had to begin to imagine my writing career ripped away, right? In order to really get into the spirit of it and understand what he was going through. So that was really challenging. Like, why am I drawn to contemplate a catastrophic writing career, right? So his first book of poems, Cinera, was published underground, and I was really privileged to visit his village and see a copy of it there. So I don't think I have an easy answer to it. I think it was this is the longest gestating project of my life. It took me 40 years. I started in 1983, and then it was, basically published last year. So it was such a strange odyssey. And then, of course, as I shared, all of the mystical, weird stuff in it. And that sense of apprenticeship, right? I mean, I was just kind of beginning. I wasn't too far out of college. I went to Stanford. I started writing poetry in it there. So I was still learning about myself as a poet, even accepting myself. So this is a period, there was actually 12 years between my first book of poems in the National Poetry Series and my second. And it was, like I say, a long process of, first there was writer's block, then there was translation, and then a slow discovery of my mature voice as a poet there. So for me, it was a very willed process, right? It wasn't exactly organic. And I had never done translations except for like high school translations of Lorca. So I'm really glad I gave myself years and years to like tinker with these translations and get them into some form that felt really good to me in English there. So that's sort of a long answer, but it's a great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Kyle. And also a great answer. And that again brings me back to Jane Hirschfield's article where she talks about like a plurality of being. Like I already closed the tab, but there's this really great line about knowing that there is like, I think it's something along the lines of like there is no real elsewhere because there's also no real here, or like that both of those things exist. So what you're describing seems like a true plurality of your lives, and your life, and sort of inhabiting Salvador's life and where he was coming from to write this poetry. Meanwhile, you're also finding your own way in your work. Uh,
Exactly.
so
You know,
it's
Kaya, one of the nice things about the Hirschfeld quote you read at the beginning is that it can be applied to any form of literature. Really, it's fiction, it's poetry. It is the boundaries that literature can go beyond, and it's what, in a sense, unites translation without. I mean, translation is just another version of writing, right? So it's nice to see, whether you're talking about translation or whether you're talking about fiction writing, this is what literature can do. And that's what's nice about that quote, as well as the translation part.
absolutely.
For me, it was a very physical, practical process. Like, I'd grown up studying Castilian Spanish, but there isn't much awareness of the fact that there are four languages in Spain, including Catalan. So if you know Spanish well, I mean, you've got about half of the words in Catalan. At the time that I started learning to read Catalan, I didn't know French yet, and adding French is helpful. It was very old fashioned. I got the books and I used to have to cut them with a penknife and go through them. So I went through first David H. Rosenthal's English translations of Espriu. Then I read Spanish translations of Espriu. Then I kind of learned to read the Catalan. So I've never become fluent in Catalan because I've never stayed in Barcelona long enough to do that. But I do have a very good reading grasp there. But like I said, it was even like this physical sense of moving through three languages. Again, because I was on this sort of quest that became very dramatic there for a while. So learning about, well, I learned a lot about language as being a specific window onto a world, and the importance of preservation through learning to read a recently banned language. So I've found myself since then drawn to languages and dialects. Like, I lived in Hawaii recently for 3 years, and I also wrote a book inspired by Gullah culture and Gullah language. And these are all languages where people were persecuted, especially when they were children, for speaking. So that appealed to my sense of justice as an African American, right? If people ask me about learning to read, it's like, yes, that's part of my sense of justice. And I met excuse me, a Catalan scholar recently said, "Oh, Cyrus, you're an honorary Catalan after all of this work." It's like, yes. So the book, To the Cypress Again and Again, Tribute to Salvador Espriu, is a hybrid, and I read from the introduction. I have my translations of Espriu, and then I have poems that I developed that I wrote for Espriu over the course of many years. So it's a combination of three things. And one of the poems is in both our voices. It's about my journey to meet him and his response to me, and then my response to him after his death. So it really is, I guess it's a feat of ventriloquism there. But my formal educational training is as an actor more than anything else. So it seems in line with my acting skill that I would actually even try and have a poem where I'm speaking in Espriu's voice there.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And speaking of voices, I think, and in a matter of, yeah, like speaking through other people's voices, I think I'm going to take that as a segue to move on to Jennifer Kellogg, Jennifer R. Kellogg, who translates from the Greek. And one of the things we wanted to touch on is so Jenny translates George Seferis's poetry from Greek, and he's male. Jenny is female. And I think, and also Seferis is, as Jenny said, not only a national treasure, but a very, very male voice. And I think that's something that we should also talk about, how that has expanded Jenny's translation and writerly path.
Thank you, Kaya. Thank you, everyone. Hello to my friends in Rochester and beyond. I'm Jenny Kellogg. I am a white woman with curly hair and blue glasses and a pink and white polka dot shirt today. And I'm very honored to be here to be speaking about my translations of George Seferis, who, yes, was a male who lived from 1900 to 1971. And he was a Greek poet, diplomat, and literary critic who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1963. And as a diplomat for the Greek nation, he served during the Metaxas dictatorship of the 1930s, in exile in World War II, during the Greek Civil War, and the Cyprus crisis of the 1950s. And yes, he is a national literary treasure for Greece, known as a very dour and difficult poet, kind of a very somber man. And I really resonated with what Cyrus was talking about an odyssey of getting to translate this poet and how I think our relationships with the poets or authors that we translate are personal journeys of transformation. And that's why it can be an odyssey. So for me, I discovered George Seferis in my junior year modern Greek literature class in Athens in the 90s. And I felt that he had a unique voice speaking to some of the traumas that Greeks had experienced in the 20th century, beginning with World War I and being exiled from his home, which is now in the country of Turkey, when he was a teenager. And so that voice, which was so serious and so pained, really, it captivated me. And I stayed with it for decades as I did my doctorate in Greek literature. And I retranslated a lot of his work as part of my doctorate. But I always held the goal that I could be his translator. And he has pretty much exclusively been translated by men, by white men of the greatest generation. And that's how his voice was shaped. And so the book that I translated, it's called Book of Exercises 2. And it's coming out from World Poetry Books in November of this year. This was a book that was kind of seen as leftovers or remainders and wasn't translated in the collected works, wasn't included first by the poet himself. He was preparing the book when he received word of the Nobel. And so it kind of got put aside as he went through all of his Nobel publicity. But secondly, because it contains satire, political satire, poems, and experiences that were kind of outside the bounds of a diplomat's purported neutrality. And so this book kind of got forgotten in the English world, the English speaking world. And I held on to it as something that I felt when I was ready, I wanted to tackle. And so I'm very grateful to the estate of George Safaris and the community of translators, and including my friends here on this panel who listen to these drafts of these poems being read in bars in various locations around Rochester for years. So I'm honored that this has come to fruition. And I just wanted to read a few excerpts from my translation. So, as I said, this book contains poems that were written across the span of George Safaris's life. And because he was a diplomat, he traveled continuously and was part of many different difficult and tense negotiations in the history of Europe in World War II and in either time period before and after. So this first poem is called The Danubian Principality's Horse, and it was written just before World War II was formally broken out in Romania. And it's about a massive bronze statue in front of the Romanian royal palace in Bucharest. The Danubian Principality's Horse, a Caprice by Matthew Pascalis. A slope, a spear, a tree. On the other side, a horse. In the space between flow bodies, women's fragrances, men, neither joyful nor glum, decided rather than decisive. Perhaps the others decide for them, the two kings, the one inhabiting a bronze form and the other who inhabits a flesh form. Perhaps the two kings decide, or the horse. His chasm of a belly is so lightly elevated on four legs. The sound of his feet clip-clopping on the pavement excites us. The horror is never revealed. We never see the great fishhook catching us from the rusted red pier. When you notice terror's presence, you also catch sight of death. A hook-shaped sperm bursts forth from his petrifying testicles and resounds deeply, like an indifferent cannon at a stately home in Idra. This seed of death never fails to embed itself in those who are marked. They are dragged, like Achilles did Hector, on his back in the dust. Pale, naked, humiliated, past embroidered and flickering neon signs, past women's exhausted breasts, love's stagnant ditches, through burning tires and automobile exhaust, through oppressive heat and military regiments presenting their weapons while bugles hover. Surely the dead are returned to the belly of the horse, even while the dead king also rides on the horse's back, a monstrous lump, and the horse's nostrils flare in revulsion. A ritual unfolds, soundless and unknown, an offering to the man who held the globe and scepter, an offering to the horse within the man. The horse whinnies and bloodies his hooves, unsatisfied now that the rider has alchemized sleep. A ritual unfolds, devoid of priestly movements, no torches, no official rites, rather, a ritual done in our pedestrian ways, with our micro afflictions and impersonal joys, our brow furrowed as usual when we answer the ringing phone, with our tired eyes and handshake jerky when we meet someone, a sick procession held in the temporary staged world order. So that's an example of a poem that has not appeared in English before. And it actually has a accompaniment to it, which I'm not going to read, where Safaris describes an inside joke about the horse and the horse being cocktoes horse, so the horse in Cocteau's Orphée, and has a prophetic voice of the horse. And that's one of the other things about this book that's very non-Safaris, is that he writes poems from the perspective of various animals, characters, different figures that he puts his own voice through and satirizes. And so we know Safaris as a poet who spoke of myth and who used various figures from ancient Greek myth. And so when Cyrus was talking in his introduction about translation being restoration, resurrection, and renewal, that's really what I wanted to do with this book, is to renew Safaris's voice for the English-speaking public and to reveal sides of him that we haven't seen before. And if I have a few more moments, I might give a few more examples of that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So one of the things about this volume is that it includes erotica, which I think the two words Safaris and erotica are probably not spoken very often together, especially given his prominence, his profile, let's say, as a diplomat and as a Nobel. And that's one of the things that, again, as a woman, I wanted to highlight and try to bring this aspect of his voice, more of a surprising, sensual, feminine, joyful voice, into English. So most of the erotica is sort of very short. In this volume, Safaris also played with limericks. He spent a lot of his career in England, and he ended his career as the ambassador to the United Kingdom. And so this is a short erotica poem, which is not, it rhymes. It's not a limerick exactly, but it's limerick-esque. It's untitled. Anguished lips, thirsty with craving, quiver. A fresh meadow, cooled by love's river. Rider, you drove your bloodhound, so raw and quick. Breasts slick with sweat, as you gave them the slip. And that was the poem I actually workshopped in one of the Alta, like an Alta translators workshop. And I want to thank Kazim Ali, who hosted that workshop, for helping me to be a little bit more daring with it.
Well done, Kazim. Yeah, for sure.
I know him pretty well. I said, that sounds like Kazim. Yeah. We're not surprised.
Yeah, I think I needed support in really getting into the erotica, especially coming Greek. I've been studying Greek my whole life, and it's a very kind of formal practice of translation. And as the considered the inheritor of Western civilization, or the progenitor, rather, we are the inheritors of Greek civilization. There's a lot of gravitas that comes with these Greek voices that I'm hoping to just show the playful side, I hope, in this work.
I love that.
And maybe I'll close with one more playful poem.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a number of poems in this volume that come from 1946, which was in the middle of the Greek Civil War. And at that time, Safaris had taken a short leave of absence from his diplomatic career after being in exile with the Greek government during World War II. And he went to the island of Poros, and this was a time where he wrote some of his most well-known work, including a volume called Thrush. But during that time, he basically kind of took a mental health break and wrote a lot of poems, very silly poems, that were through different characters. And this poem that I'm going to read is called Mrs. Zen. And he walked the beach and picked up various detritus and made little figurines out of them. And then he wrote poems from their voices. So it has an epigraph that's in his voice. Mrs. Zen. Passerby. Empty walnut shells. For what? Matthew, and that's a Safari pseudonym. I want to make a little figurine. Passerby. You're off your rocker, old man. Leave them be. Get up and make something useful. At sunset yesterday, alone I stayed. Thorny paperwork had completely flattened me. And so, empty, upon my useless desk I leaned, watching a fly on the screen, playing the space between me, the fresh air, and the light, which was sinking into night. The sunset seemed to incite an anxiety in the pines. Their branches reminded me of hands searching for doves, a sudden terror. On that night when I found in my embrace that love had died by the grace of torch-bearing Hecate. My fingers played idly with a hollow walnut shell and a smaller one as well, plus an acorn, dallying with some branches that I cut together with a rush. Like an octopus's murky ink, the mind gradually unwound its kinks. No more need to think. An unknown rhythm, weaving a body in secret, conceiving. A weakness in the knees awakened a dormant fleece. The wind picked up speed. My thoughts in the weeds grew deeper and deeper still, closer to the shells, the trill of inner sounds, etched lips, pieces that suited my fingers. Slowly they drew away from me and grew fainter until nothing else remained but a healing pulse and this tiny person whom I call Mrs. Zen. Thank you.
I do have a quick question about Jenny, about your horizons being expanded. So my rough understanding of what it means to be a Hellenist is all things Greek. Or Greek studies. So how has your, I mean, you did your dissertation was the translation of Safari's poems, correct? But is that how your Hellenist journey, is that how it started out?
No, I studied Latin in the Rochester, New York City schools, beginning in middle school. And I wanted to get my PhD in Greek at age 16. That was my goal in ancient Greek. And so I went to college at a place where I could study ancient Greek, and I was on track to become a classicist. And that was really where I learned about translation, where translation was utilitarian to demonstrate your knowledge of Latin and Greek grammar and, be able to kind of faithfully translate Euripides or something like that. And I went to Greece for my junior year abroad. I lived in Athens, and it was mandatory that we enroll in modern Greek. And at that point, I switched my focus to wanting a PhD in modern Greek. And I also studied creative writing. I went to School of the Arts in Rochester, and I was a creative writing major, and I studied poetry. And I had a wonderful education in poetry because of Writers and Books and the literary community in Rochester in the 90s. And so being a classicist just became too creatively limiting. And that's when I switched to modern Greek and brought the experience of understanding classical languages and education into translating modern Greek, and why I ended up with Safaris, who's a poet who has his own version of the great Hellenic past and Greek literature.
Very great. Well, I'm glad it directed your path into the translation world, because now we know you as well. And I love seeing.
Jen, I have a question as well.
Yes.
You mentioned kind of translating, translating a Nobel Prize winner, someone who's a major figure in not just Greek literature, but world literature. The question I have is just in terms of some of the difficulties you face as a translator to bring him and his voice into a modern audience, not just, you talk about the gendered aspect of it, but just a modern audience so that it's kind of it's refreshed in a sense. I mean, you use the word micro affliction in one of the poems, which seems very modern. Some of the last poem, there were some shorter sentences, things like that. I don't know, having not read, of course, his work in Greek. I'm curious as some of the challenges you may have faced and some of the things you did to kind of get over the ballast that translating someone with such a big background can have on a translator. That's a difficult process. I'm just curious how you navigated that.
It took years. I really appreciated when Cyrus said it took him 40 years because it was a process of somewhat unlearning and undoing the voices and expectations. Quite honestly, when I started working on my dissertation and I talked to people in the field about retranslating Safaris, no one thought that was necessary. And it was like his voice has been established. It's been established in this way. And even when I started in the 90s, it felt like, well, this language is coming from the 50s and 60s. Surely it should be updated for a poet who has so much to offer, so much that his voice to me, even though, he died before I was born, it has the questions that he struggled with about belonging, identity, European identity. What does it mean to go through these great wars and come out still alive? And how do you speak for the survivors? How do you speak for a plurality of experiences, as Kaya was talking about in the beginning, and still try to inspire the people that you feel you represent and belong to? Those questions to me are still very, very relevant. So, I mean, I'm just starting the promotion for this book. My experience is that people know and remember Safaris and that people are hungry to continue reading him. And so my hope with the global wars and traumas that we're all witnessing, especially in Palestine right now, I mean, these questions of identity, minority, belonging, genocide, they're still entirely relevant. So that's my approach to it, and it's really just a question of staying true to what you feel is important to do to bring this voice into the world and trying to overcome whatever overwhelming expectations you may feel from the literary establishment or from translating a voice of this stature. Humility. I maintain my humility. That's the best thing I can say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think I don't want to make light of anything that Jenny said, but I will point out I think, very harsh pivot from the things Cyrus was talking about and the things Jenny was talking about to our friends in Denmark who
Why harsh?
maybe the harshest thing they've had is to create Lego so that the rest of the world can step on it. I think Lego's from Denmark. But yeah, so this is I hope that there's something to connect those those things. I don't want to hear just about trauma, but Let's see what you could bring to the table for us. Our final panelist is K.E. Zemmel, who I've known for years as a translator from Danish. And Kyle is planning on reading from something from Simon Frølund.
Mm-hmm.
I hope your partner Pia forgives my Danish pronunciation, and you can also forgive me.
She will forgive you.
Yeah, so Kyle, please.
Yes, thanks. And again, thank you to Writers and Books and to all of you. This is a fantastic panel, fantastic idea for a panel. I am a balding, middle-aged Caucasian male. I'm your typical average balding white male, wearing a blue sweater and a blue sport coat and eyeglasses. So what I'm going to do is read from a contemporary novelist, very, very different from either the two that you just heard. Simon Frølund is he's still alive. He's about 60 at this point. He might be mad at me for saying that because he might not be that. He might be more like 55. But he has written about 5 works, primarily of fiction, and that is what I translate primarily as well, is fiction. So I'm going to read a short passage from his collection Milk, which I translated and was published about 10 years ago by SFWP, and then I'm going to switch into something that I have written kind of in response to this particular story. I'm only reading part of the story, and then I'm only reading part of this other thing, and I'll get to that in a second. This is a story called Kramer, and I'm jumping in. One afternoon, as I stood by the window, I heard a strange noise in the hallway. I stepped over the creaky board in the entryway and leaned carefully against the door. With my fingers, I pushed the little cap away from the peephole. At first, I couldn't see anything. It was nearly dark in the hallway. But then I noticed a crumpled figure sitting halfway down the stairwell. It was our upstairs neighbor, Mr. Kramer. He sat hunched over with his arms crossed at the knee and his white head resting on his arms. The sound I'd heard was a low, irregular snore. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway and stood looking at him. I don't know how much time passed, 5 minutes, maybe more. Suddenly he stopped snoring and lifted his head and looked at me. "Oh," he said, "it's you." "Mr. Kramer," I said, "don't you think you should go to bed?" "Yes," he said. Then his head fell forward again. Some time passed. This time he didn't snore. "Mr. Kramer," I said. "Yes?" He said, sleepily, surprised. "You shouldn't sleep here." "No." Then he rose, and I could tell he wasn't really awake. He stood swaying in the middle of the stairwell. "Grab the banister," I said. I turned on the light and kept my finger on the switch so it wouldn't click off again. I could see a wet stain on the stairs where he'd been sitting. I could also see a big dark spot on the seat of his pants. He squeezed the banister with both hands and started up the stairs one step at a time. "Are you okay?" I said. "Oh, yes," he said, "I'm okay." I went back into my apartment and filled a bucket with soap and water. When I returned to the stairwell, he was sitting on the top step. He sat with his head between his long legs, and he looked as though he might fall over at any moment. I set the bucket down and climbed up to him. I jostled his arm lightly. "Yeah?" he said. "Come on." I extended my hand and helped him get up. He put his arm around my neck, with his other arm on the banister supporting himself. When we climbed a few steps, he stopped and looked at me. "It's awfully nice of you to do this," he said. "It's all right," I said. "I mean it," he said. "It's really nice of you." We continued our climb. He felt heavier with each step. "We're almost there," I said. He stopped again. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," I said. "How old are you?" "I'm 25. "Oh," he said, "so young." After we reached the landing, he stopped and searched his pockets. He still had his arm around me. "Can I offer you anything?" he said. "No, thanks." "I mean it," he said. "You need to get some sleep." "No," he said, "I can always do that." I pulled away from him. Another time, I said, smiling. I went back down. I picked up the bucket at the foot of the stairs and began cleaning up. I dried the puddle halfway up the stairs, and as I was about to clean the mess from his wet pants at the top of the stairwell, I realized that he was standing in front of his door. Mr. Kramer, I said, go to bed now. Oh, he said. Mr. Kramer, I said. That's when I saw his hand working in the crotch of his pants. At that same moment, he turned, and I met his triumphant stare as he ejaculated onto the stairs. He held my gaze. His eyes suddenly seemed yellow. It was a little like seeing into a cat's eyes. Then I rushed down the stairs. And so, to me, going back to Cyrus earlier, his translations and how he somehow managed to kind of divorce his own poetry from his translations. I'm fascinated by that because for me, working with Simon has been this rich well of imagination. I've translated 3 of his books, and I've come to realize that in some ways his work has kind of been absorbed by my imagination. And I'm now, in this particular case I'm about to read, which is essentially my debut novel that will come out later this year, where I've basically inserted the narrator, the protagonist, into this scene on the stairwell, because that scene has always fascinated me. And this is in part 1 of the book called Kramer is Dead. In this story, the following day, Kramer is found dead in the translation. So in my story, we do it this way. When he moved to Copenhagen with his Danish girlfriend, Kat, 15 years ago, Losman imagined his life like a Fodor's guidebook, rich with possibility and adventure. But it didn't turn out that way, because no life ever did. And now that Kat had left him, he lived alone, except for on the weekends his son, Axel, visited. Losman was a literary translator. On an average day, he woke up, made coffee, and got to work filling Word documents with letters. 10 pages a day, that was his goal. On this particular day, he would discover a dead man, punch a swan to save a little girl, and find an experimental memory study that would alter his life and possibly his brain chemistry forever. Not an average day at all. But at this moment, all that was in the near future. Now, in the present, he sat at his desk, gaping at his fuzzy computer screen, having made it through 6 tedious pages of translation, when he was startled by a knock at his door. It was a soft, hesitant rap, as if whoever was knocking was sorry to interrupt. Losman wasn't sure what he'd heard was real or imagined, but it left him momentarily breathless with anticipation. A visitor? Did he have a visitor? He cocked his ear to listen, and he heard it again, louder, definitely a knock. "Et ogenblik," he said, standing abruptly. He rummaged the floor for his pants and slid them on as he stumbled across the room. When he opened the door, he found his upstairs neighbor, Caroline Jensen, standing on the landing dressed in a green gabardine coat and cloche hat. "Yes," he said. "Herr Kramer fell," she said, pointing a slender finger up the stairwell. 2 flights above lived a crotchety old man named Kramer, an overweight, alcoholic, former postman Losman didn't care for. Losman stared at Caroline's jet black fingernails. "How do you know he fell?" she said. "How do you know he fell?" he said. "I heard a loud thud last night when I was making coffee." "Last night?" Losman said. "Can you help?" He glanced at his laptop behind him. He still had 4 pages to translate, and he didn't like to step away from his day's work prematurely. The anxiety it caused him would swell like a tumor and increase his tics. But he knew that he couldn't say no, not to Caroline Jensen. He followed her up the stairs like an obedient puppy. Nervous and anxious, his Tourette besting him like the lord and master it was, he squelched an urge to jerk his head and blow out a noisy puff of air. When they reached Kramer's door, she raised her hand and knocked. "Herr Kramer," she said. "Herr Kramer, won't you open up?" There was no answer. "I assume you don't have a key," Losman said. She shook her head. "Maybe he's not home." "He's home." Caroline nodded the long rectangular mail slot that was a staple in old apartment buildings like this. "See for yourself." Losman squatted. He took a deep breath, pushed his index finger through the slot, and lifted the lid. A decadent odor, pungent of cigarettes and feces, stung his eyes and mouth. He flinched, pulling his hand away from the slot and gasping for air. Did you see him? Not yet, Losman coughed. After covering his mouth and nose with his left bicep, he lifted the lid one more time. Holding his breath, he now saw a mountain of letters and magazines and newspapers piled on the floor. Losman scanned the room. What he was looking at was an apartment that was the perfect replica of his own, only in reverse. There was a recliner, a sofa, and a coffee table. At the far end, straight ahead, a wall yellowed by cigarette smoke divided the living room from the galley kitchen behind it. And there, Losman saw a pair of unmoving legs sprawled out on the floor in the hallway, surrounded by broken glass. The other half of Kramer's body was lying on the kitchen linoleum, out of sight. Losman got to his feet. You better call somebody, he said to Caroline, wanting desperately to shake his head or clear his throat or blink or snort. I think Kramer is dead. And I'll stop there.
Awesome preview of your book. Yeah, you were talking, I mean, talk to us more about that. With the time we have left, please, about using translation as a creative, like a drive for writing your own fiction.
Well, I think it starts actually with the fact that when you're a translator, as Jenny and Cyrus know, you spend a lot of time, and you too, for that matter, Kaya, you spend a lot of time doing that actual work. It's, I've always wanted to be a fiction writer. First and foremost, I was going to be a fiction writer. So I've been writing for 30 years, but when I met someone, a Danish woman, found in love, that story, moved to Denmark, learned Danish. That everybody knows that's a famous story. And because I had this background in literary studies, English, I wanted to somehow be involved in that. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to be a translator. So I didn't have, like Jenny's insight of wanting to do classic Greek at age 16. That blows me away, because I certainly did not at age 16. But once I started the idea of being a translator, it was a wonderful way to actually practice and to study kind of fiction writing from people who are doing it. So in a sense, I always see translation as this. It's kind of like being an artist in a museum and copying the masters. They're not always masters, maybe, but at the same time, you're copying, you're learning from that. And so I was seeing it in that way, but also spending a great deal of time doing it. And so it felt as though I was spending more time on the translation work than on my own writing. And so at this point, about 15 years ago, I started writing a crime novel, because I was translating a lot of crime novels at the time, but I set it in upstate or Western New York. And so I was deliberately, even then, kind of taking ideas and concepts or whatever and trying to translate them, not simply word to word from language, from a book to another book, but actually thinking about how I could reimagine a crime novel, say, that's set in the southern tier of New York State. And so that book was, I had an agent for that book. He shopped it around. I got great feedback and great rejections, all for the book, but ultimately, it didn't go anywhere. And so when I was, I spent 10 years writing on that book. And so this one, I decided that I would, do that maxim and say, I'm going to write what I know. And that is, literary translation. It's Soeurette, it's Copenhagen or Denmark. And these are the things that I could write this relatively easily. But that image from Kramer has constantly stayed with me all throughout, ever since I translated it nearly 20 years ago now. And so that seemed like a really natural place to begin. So I'm playfully riffing on the idea of translation in that sense.
And that's wonderful. And this is something that I say to students all the time, is that particularly when I'm talking about like an editorial lecture, is that I think in order to be a great editor, but also to be a great translator, one needs to be a great and voracious reader. And I think that also goes with being a great writer. I think to be a great translator, I've rarely talked to anyone who's a translator who doesn't have some sort of interest or background in creative writing. And most of them are truly voracious readers. And I say read everything from the back of the shampoo bottle to, you know, the user manual for your grandfather's snowblower. Like, all these things can only inform you. And I think that also, Kyle, you are creating this idea, or furthering this idea of the plurality, like multiple universes. And I love this idea of like disconnecting. And, you know, it's kind of like I've been starting to call it like the Paul Auster effect of like, you know, you're using characters and putting them in other places. And I think it's very fun.
Yeah, I'm a sucker for that, I'll be honest. But I'm also not translating, you know, renowned figures. I mean, Simon's a wonderful writer and a terrific guy, but he's not going to win the Nobel Prize any more than I would. So, you know, the writers that, you know, we've heard earlier it's just a different stratosphere. So it's I don't have that same ballast hanging on me. But maybe it also be great. I'd be curious to know Cyrus and Jenny's take on that. You know, taking a character from the work that they're doing and making a poem or a story out of that. That might be kind of cool too.
Yeah, it's happened a couple times. I think for me, what I wanted to say, Kyle, is that because Espriu died and never responded to my translations, I had a completely different experience with Francesc, because Francesc is perhaps the most famous translator in Catalan culture. I mean, he's famous for translating The Lord of the Rings into Catalan. And when I mentioned my friend Alex translating the four quartets and how I was just shocked, like, oh, what are you working on, the four quartets? I'd be like, well, I wouldn't even begin to try to translate literature that's sort of sacred in English. So out of necessity, out of survival, literary and otherwise, they had to translate as much literature as they could, just as their task there. But there's something about being able to work with a translator. I got a first ever resident fellowship in Barcelona to work with Francesc, and it made all the difference, right? And so, yeah, I'm working on a new book of poems, and it's actually a tribute to Italian writers, to Cesare Pavese, to Umberto Saba, and I'm taking some of their characters and put them in this new book of poems there. So there is this sort of crossing between characters and literatures. I've been mostly working with Umberto Saba's episodic novel. It wasn't finished, called Ernesto, because I'm writing about queer adolescence, mostly in the first half of the 20th century. So I just read this poetry. At the end of his life, he wrote this novel about a homoerotic encounter when he was a kid, a teenager, that seemed to fit into my theme of queer adolescence. So I'm almost done with that.
Nice.
Very nice. I don't know if any, Jenny, Kyle, Cyrus, any of you have any more questions for each other or comments, anything that came to mind that you didn't get to bring up?
I'm not sure how much time we have left.
I think we're running out.
Yeah, we set at, it says 5 minutes, but I'm not sure if
we have a minute now.
Yes, if our host is going to jump in and close out for us, or if we are to close out on our own. Oh, there we go.
Hello, I just that was really wonderful. I want to thank all of you for being here. Jenny, Kaya, Cyrus, Kyle, thank you for the wonderful readings and the urgent and memorable conversation that took place today. I really appreciate it. In fact, I wish I could hear you guys talk forever. I guess I just want to remind everyone that all of our wonderful panelists and our moderator, that their books are available through Ampersand's website and in person. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Wonderful
Kaya.
to be
Thank
with
you,
you.
Kyle.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.